Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Robert Swartwood here. Tonight, I am joined by the New York Times best-selling author of 17 novels, most recently, The Oligarch's Daughter. His books have won numerous awards, including the Strand Critics Award for Best Novel for Buried Secrets, the International Thriller Writers Award for Best Novel for Killer Instinct, and the Barry Award for Best Thriller for Company Man. The Boston Globe has called him a master of the modern thriller. Two of his novels have been made into motion pictures, High Crimes and Paranoia. That's right, it's your favorite writer and mine, Joseph Finder. Joe, how the heck are you?
I'm good, Robert. How are you? Good to be
Good.
here.
And I forgot to ask, I pronounced that last name correctly, right?
Bender,
Yes. Okay.
Bender, not fine.
I thought so. I was watching because then I started second guessing it earlier, and I was watching some videos, and I saw Hannity had called you Finder, and I'm like, that doesn't sound right. Back in the day.
Oh, but it was too late to correct him.
So you also have a Wikipedia page, and every time I talk to a writer who has a Wikipedia page, I always want to do kind of a Rich Eisen celebrity true or false type thing on there. So one of it says that you were born in Chicago, blah blah blah. You spent much of your early childhood in Afghanistan and the Philippines. Is that true or false?
That is true.
Or how like at what age were you there, and what age did you come back?
I was little, but I lived in Kabul, Afghanistan when I was two, and I learned before I learned English, I learned Farsi because my parents had servants taking care of me while they were gone, and I learned Farsi. And my parents came home, and I would speak to them in Farsi.
Do you
And
do you still speak Farsi well?
no,
No.
I've forgotten.
Hmm.
But on my deathbed, when I'm trying to come up with my great last words, they'll probably be in Farsi.
How about any other languages? Do you speak any other languages?
Just Russian.
Just Russian.
Yeah.
Is it like really fluent?
There was a time when it was. I'm pretty rusty by now. I spoke well enough that I could go to Russia and get around and speak with what they told me was a Leningrad accent.
Mm.
Back in the day, it was called Leningrad. And I haven't spoken it in years, so it's pretty rusty by now.
Yeah. Well, and then also part of the bio says that you were a bass singer in the Yale Whiffenpoofs. Is that correct? Am I saying that correctly?
When you say it, yeah, that's right.
Did
Yeah,
the
it's an a cappella group uh, for seniors only. And when I was in it, it was all men, and now it's co-ed. And it was a lot of fun. Some of my best friends are were in the Whiffenpoofs with me.
do you still sing at all?
No, and when I drive, I sing.
Hmm.
Uh, I miss it. I miss it.
And so it also says here you majored in Russian studies at Yale University, and then also your first book was a nonfiction called Red Carpet: The Connection Between the Gremlin and America's Most Powerful Businessmen, which you could probably revisit this. You could do a revised a revised version or a sequel. But
Right.
I mean, clearly, you had that interest in Russia. I mean, so what brought on that initial interest in studying Russia?
When I was a kid, I my older sister took Russian, and she had some books in her room, one of which I took down, which was a collection of short stories by Gogol, the Russian writer Gogol. And there was a story called The Nose about a guy whose nose disappears from his face and ends up walking down the streets of the city. The nose does, dressed up like a bureaucrat, whatever that means. Anyway, I read this story, and I thought, now this is really cool. This is sort of the first adult story I'd read. And I thought that any language that produce a writer like Gogol was something I was kind of interested in. I mean, I was a kid, but so when I was in seventh grade, my junior high school offered Russian, and I decided to take it. And I had a very good Russian teacher, and I became interested. And this happens, when you study a language. I became interested in the culture and the country and the food, and it sort of took over. So that by the time I went to college, I decided I wanted to major in Russian studies. I don't know why I did major in Russian studies. I mean, this wasn't a way to get a job, um, but it was something that was intellectually interesting to me. So I studied Russian language, Russian literature, Russian history, Soviet politics, Soviet history, and I wrote a senior thesis on Soviet history, in fact. So it sort of became something that took me over. And then I decided, because I didn't know what else to do, to go to graduate school. Uh, Harvard offered me a scholarship, um, all expenses paid. And I thought, I don't have a job. I have no other prospects. Why not try it? So I kind of stumbled into these things.
Yeah, have you at that point had you visited Russia?
Uh, Not until uh, after I graduated from college. And the first time I went was actually to do research for my first book, Red Carpet. Um, and so Red Carpet was a book about the most powerful American businessmen who had connections to the Kremlin. Chief among them was Dr. Armand Hammer, who was known as the Kremlin's favorite capitalist. And I read about him in People magazine, and then I read about him in the Letters of Lenin, which I was studying in my graduate course. And in one of Lenin's letters, he addresses Hammer as Comrade Armand Hammer. And I knew that when a Soviet leader called you comrade, that meant you had to be a member of the Communist Party. So I thought that this is interesting, that the Kremlin's favorite capitalist was not a capitalist, but a communist. And so that's when I decided to write a book that dealt with Dr. Armand Hammer. So I went to Moscow really to do investigative journalism, to try to find out, if I could, find anyone who knew Hammer back in the day. Hammer had gone to Moscow when he was in his 20s in 1921. And he stayed there. He lived there for almost 10 years. And this was a really interesting time for an American to live in Russia, because it was just becoming the Soviet Union and Stalin was taking over. So I eventually, when I was in Moscow, found a guy who was Armand Hammer's case officer, he told me, for the KGB. And when I learned that Hammer had worked for the KGB, I realized I had a pretty big story there.
So
Uh,
at that point, had you written anything else like short stories, articles, anything? I mean, just deciding, I don't know, I mean, coming at this from just somebody who likes writing books and fiction, it's a big task just to sit down and write a novel. You just decided one day you were going to write a nonfiction book?
Well, what I really wanted to do was write a novel, and I was afraid to do it. And I decided that it would be easier to write a nonfiction book than to write fiction. Because I knew how to write nonfiction. That was easy. Uh, it was the writing fiction part that I found really intimidating. So I wrote this nonfiction book, and uh, I it got me in a lot of trouble. Dr. Armand Hammer threatened to sue me for libel for publishing the fact that he had worked for the KGB. But you know, the truth is the absolute defense when it comes to a libel suit. And Hammer was never going to really sue me for libel. He just threatened to sue me for libel. And he tried to scare off my publisher. And he had his people buy up as many copies of my book as they could, um, which meant the book sold really well.
Yeah, sounds great. So was Russia, I don't know, was Russia then like Russia is now? Like what was there any point where you worried for the safety of your life for having, basically gone against somebody that high up?
I was a little nervous about that. I was more nervous about being arrested by the KGB just for being an investigative journalist and because Russia, you know, I I came back one day after meeting some people, some dissidents, and the phone rang in my hotel room, and it was a guy who told me that Russia did not believe in investigative journalism, and that if I was smart, I would stop it. And I realized this was a kind of a threat, and I decided to take him up on it and not do any more. But I'd already gotten the investigative work done that I wanted to get done. And I left the country, and I had the basis for a book that was really kind of a kind of, it wasn't a blockbuster because it didn't sell enough copies, but it was a book that got a lot of legal threats, got a lot of attention, it got a lot of reviews. And this was my first book. And I just thought, man, I've just taken on one of the world's richest men. You're afraid to write fiction?
So
You know,
at that point then, had you had a publisher already, or you were basically just going to write the nonfiction book and then kind of go through that process of finding any? I mean, had you had an agent at that point? I mean, where were you, um, in that process at that time?
I had a publisher through a friend, a writer friend in Boston. I met his agent, and the agent sold my book to a publisher for $10,000. And I went to Moscow knowing I had this contract, so it was um, a, a kind of a difficult way to start because I didn't know anybody. I didn't know how to get a book published. I didn't know how to write a book really. But eventually I figured it out. And I was able to do it and still support myself as a writer for $10,000. Took me about a year to write the book. And when it was done, you know, I I had this final product that, as much as I enjoyed writing the book, I knew I wanted to do something different. I wanted to tell fiction. I wanted to write a story. So what I then did was I gave myself 3 years to teach myself how to write a novel. And I made a list of the greatest thrillers. And because I knew I wanted to write a thriller, because that's what I read. And I took notes. I would read a book, a thriller. I would take notes about how we met the protagonist, how we met the antagonist, what happened, what the setup in the book was like, what the ending of the book was like. Really took notes on how to do it. And by the time I'd read through all these books, it was about 50 thrillers, I had this file of notes, index cards, based on how to write a novel. Now, that's not the same thing as writing a novel, but it was a good start.
What books were those? Do you remember the books that you had, decided were the
Oh,
best?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a long list, but they ranged from early thrillers like Eric Ambler and Graham Greene to Ken Follett's The Eye of the Needle to Frederick Forsyth's The Day of the Jackal to Martin Cruz Smith's Gorky Park. So it was sort of a real range of thrillers. And there were some really, really good ones that remain my favorite books.
Real quick, so to just jump back, were you reading things like you had mentioned that you had come to Russia because of the short story when you were, it was what, in middle school. So were you also reading certain things then that really kind of made you want to become a writer at that point?
When I was a kid,
Yeah.
I when I was 8 and 9, I read a book, kind of a sort of sci-fi light for kids called The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet. And I loved this book, and I turned my friends onto it in third grade. And I loved the book so much that I wrote a letter to the author. And in those days, when you wrote a letter to the author, of course, this is way before the internet, the letter would go to the publisher, and the publisher would put it in a pile and send a pile to the author months later. So eventually, I got a letter back from the author, whose name was Eleanor Cameron, but it was a form letter. However, I had the return address, her return address in Monterey, California. And I wrote her a letter saying, but you didn't answer my questions. And to her credit, she wrote back this long, maybe 2-page typed letter answering my questions. And I thought to myself, how cool is this? It was kind of a realization that behind a book was a person. I know that seems so elementary, but to realize that a human being was behind this thing, who wrote the book, who wrote letters, and I just thought this would be a cool job if I could ever get one like this, to write books. And I swore that when fans wrote to me, I would answer them, you know? So that's one of the reasons why I answer every email, because I want to do what Eleanor Cameron did.
That's cool. And then did you never had a chance to meet her or like actually talk to her?
I
It was
did.
just by letters. Oh, you did?
I did much later. I saw that she was coming to Cambridge, I was living in Cambridge, and I sent her a letter, and I said, "You will not remember me, but dot dot dot." And she wrote back and saying, "Yes, I do remember you. You because we had corresponded for several years after that." And I told her, "Well, I became a writer because of you, and I would love to make dinner for you." So she came over to my apartment and I made dinner for her and we just talked. And I don't know if it was cool for her, but it was cool for me
Yeah.
to get to meet this person, who had made me become a writer.
Oh, I'm sure it was. I mean, it has to be very, very flattering to have someone say. And at what point in your career had you had that happened?
I think this was while I was trying to write fiction.
Okay, so like you hadn't really like become Joseph Finder yet or anything, but
Hadn't,
still, I
hadn't,
mean,
yeah, I hadn't published a novel at that point. Um, when I did, I sent her a copy of the book, but that was late in her life. Um, no, this is when I was still trying to make my way as a writer
yeah.
and deciding I wanted to write fiction and not nonfiction. And I never wrote another nonfiction book. That was the one I wrote, and everything I've done since then has been fiction.
Yeah, so Red Carpet came out, it looks here. It was published in 1983. The
Oh,
Moscow Club, your first novel, came out in 1991.
yeah.
Was the Moscow Club was that your was that obviously it's your first published novel, but was that like your first novel, or had there been other books you had written prior to that that just did not sell or just didn't like work out well?
The answer is it was sort of a combination of things. So the novel that became the Moscow Club was about the 25th draft of a novel that started out with a title, some stupid title like Who's Buried in Lenin's Tomb? And it kind of went from being this sort of lightweight, jokey kind of novel to a much more serious conspiracy story. And so it took me many drafts to find an agent and then to find a publisher. And the book that was eventually published as the Moscow Club um, was so different from the way it started that it might as well have been, you know, um, my 10th book because I wrote so many drafts of that book. But that was the process by which I taught myself how to write a novel, was just by writing it. I mean, all those index cards helped, but the only way to really learn how to write it is to just sit down and write it.
Yeah.
And you learn as you do it what works and what doesn't work.
And then for people who aren't aware, and we can get into this in a little bit, just the business obviously of writing, because there is obviously the storytelling aspect where you're just sitting down, you're writing a novel, but then it's actually getting it published. It's making sure it gets into readers' hands. And so when you sold Moscow Club, was that for what was it just a one book deal or was it a two book deal where all of a sudden then you were basically had a deadline to get another book done within a certain amount of time, despite the fact that it took you so long to write the first one.
It was actually a two-book deal. And it was with Viking Penguin, and they were a terrific publisher. And I I think when I started out, I didn't know the importance of publishing a book a year if you could. Um, it took me several years to do the next book. Um, they say that the second book is the hardest. Um, Once you've actually written a book, then to sort of and had it published, then to sort of uh, be sort of cognizant of what it's like, what the drawbacks are, what it's like to be reviewed, good and bad. It makes you nervous in ways that you're not nervous when you're publishing your first book, when you're writing your first book. I think when you're writing your first novel, you're kind of in a daze. You have no idea who's going to read it. You have no idea whether it's going to be any good or not. You're just trying your best to make it as good as possible. So it the second book, you're much more self-aware, I think. So that one took me a few years, the second book, which is a book called Extraordinary Powers.
Did you, and so one of the interviews I had watched earlier t today to kind of prep for this, although I don't really do too much prep because I just, again, always want to have a very natural conversation. You had said that at one point you and Lee Child really got into a argument about outlining. Because he's
Yeah.
very much, just sit down and just let the story kind of go where it goes. And I mean, are you still like, has that changed over the years, or is it still the same where
Yeah.
you feel that you need to
Yeah.
map out the story before you really get into it?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I had the same agent as Robert Ludlum, and I met Ludlum, and Ludlum told me he advised me strongly to write a long, comprehensive outline. And his outlines would be the equivalent of 150 typed pages, single spaced. And so I tried that for one book. And by the time I finished the outline, I didn't want to write the book because I
Yeah,
had done it already.
yeah.
You know, wasn't fun anymore. So yeah, so years later, um, Lee Child and I agreed to collaborate on a short story. And he said, "So, would you like to start or should I start?" I said, "Why don't you start?" So he started the story and he sent it to me. And I read this opening and I wrote back to him. I said, "So, where do you envision this going from here?" And he wrote back and he said, "I have absolutely no idea." And I said, "Oh man, he's serious about this."
I'd
And
rather leave that to the professionals.
sorry about that. I don't know what that
All right.
was. All right. Anyway, um, and he did not, so he would write something, I would write something, he would write something. We went back and forth and back and forth. And eventually I began to try to sort of foil him as much as possible. I would create a plot twist that would make it impossible for Reacher to get out of it. And he enjoyed this. It was kind of a game. But so Lee said, why don't you, so you've tried it with an outline, try writing a book without an outline. And I did. Uh, I wrote one book without an outline, and it took me months longer than it would have if I had some kind of an outline. Because I would write scenes and then realize a week later that those scenes didn't work. And so I eventually decided that what I would do would be to write what in Hollywood they call a beat sheet, just the basic beats of the story. And with those beats figured out, I then didn't have to outline beyond that. I would just sort of write as spontaneously as possible. And I had the security of knowing that I knew what the basic beats were. It was sort of like I thought of this as like writing a movie trailer where you have the basic highlights of the movie in the trailer, and I would have the highlights of the book in this beat sheet. And with that, with those things figured out, I felt free to deviate, to contradict myself, to move on in different directions, because I had a template to work from. So really what I was doing was I was teaching myself how to write fiction in a different way. Um, so what I've learned is that when you write and you allow yourself to surprise yourself, you are therefore surprising the reader. And that is something that you cannot outline. The idea of how to surprise the reader can only really happen when you surprise yourself.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the short story because that was something that I wanted to ask you about because I had a note here. That obviously was from the Face Off anthology,
Right.
where it was your character Nick Heller and obviously Jack Reacher um, together. Was that the very first collaboration you had done? And I don't think you've done any other collaborations, correct?
I think that was the only one I've ever done.
Yeah. Was
Was.
that obviously the anthology was designed to do collaborations, but I mean, is some writers enjoy collaboration, other writers do not. I mean, was that something when you came into it that you felt was like this could be a nightmare, or I mean, like were you looking forward to it?
Well, I knew it wouldn't be a nightmare because Lee Child is such a professional. Um, but I don't love collaboration. I prefer to be the boss of the story and make all the executive decisions on my own, for good or for bad. Um, so when you collaborate with someone, you're dealing with someone else's subconscious in a sense. And that's difficult, especially when you're writing fiction. It's difficult to sort of have a uh, to have an idea in your head, um, and have someone else have a completely different idea, a different idea of where the story is going to go. So, I mean, I feel like I can collaborate with people. It's not my favorite way of writing a novel, though, not a novel or a story. And I've never collaborated with anyone on writing a novel.
Yeah.
I could, but I've never tried it.
Yeah. So how did that anthology like did the like how were you assigned? Like and for people who aren't aware, go check it out. It's a great anthology. Basically just teams up a lot of thriller writers with their characters, with their main characters in these short stories. Um, but obviously it wasn't random. I mean, how did that come about where you were assigned with Lee?
Because I was the boss. I was, it was my idea. I was the one who assigned all the pairs, and I decided I wanted to write with Lee Child because I knew he was a terrific writer. And also because we wrote in sort of different ways. I didn't want to write with someone who was a clone of me. I wanted to write with someone who was different. Um, I've done fight scenes in my Nick Heller books, but Lee is a terrific, epigrammatic, elegant writer. Uh, and his style, he has a different voice from mine. So I decided that this would be interesting and useful to try to write a story with him. And it was. I mean, it was, again, it's not something I wanted to do, but working with Lee was in a lot of ways a pleasure.
Did you guys try to mesh your styles, or did you? Because I don't think I actually have read that specific story, but like obviously, Child has a very unique, very like a lot of declarative sentences or whatever else.
Yeah,
Your style's a little bit. I mean, did you guys? How did you try to make sure that it worked? So not just meshing the two characters together, but also just your writing styles.
we didn't talk about that and we didn't really work on it. It just happened
Oh,
uh,
good.
in a spontaneous way. So Lee wrote in his Jack Reacher style, and I wrote in my Nick Heller style. And I mean, they're not so crazy different, you know. They're, we both believe in declarative sentences, and we both believe in short paragraphs and short chapters and that kind of thing. Although, interestingly, I talked to Lee um, sort of early on in his career when he was shortly after, I think he'd maybe halfway through, he'd written Persuader. And I remarked upon the fact that his chapters were pretty long. They were like 25-page chapters.
A few of his books, yeah, do have like just like 10, like 15 chapters, and other ones there are much more. So yes, I noticed that.
Yeah. And I told him, I'm writing much shorter chapters. And he said, I'm going to do that too. And Lee decided that he wanted to write shorter chapters, that, the reading public liked shorter chapters. And Lee, like me, paid attention to what the reading public was reading and what they wanted. And I think that shorter chapters are a kind of result of a shorter attention span with the internet, with TV. Um, I think that people basically like shorter bursts of narrative.
Yeah.
And I know I do.
It's yeah. And
Don't
psychologically, I mean, when you were reading a book, you might say like, okay, I finished that chapter. How many more pages is the next chapter? Oh, it's just 3 pages. Okay. How many more pages is the next chapter? Oh, it's another two
right,
pages. And then before they realize that they've read 50 pages, whereas
right.
had they been like, this next chapter is 30 pages. I don't have time for that. I have to go do other stuff. So yeah, it's this weird psychological thing. The same thing with, the more white space on a page, the better. Really just kind of keeps
Yes.
people going.
I love white space. I love white space on the page. I think it's just so appealing, you know? Um, and that's why I love dialogue, because there's a lot of white space in dialogue. Um,
Speaking of dialogue, because we are I don't want to keep up too much of your time, and we definitely want to talk about the new book. Something else I remember had seen where you talked about basically cutting back on swear words, on cursing in novels, and that a lot of your earlier stuff, obviously, bad guys they use curse words, they use the F word, they use shit, damn, whatever else. But you wanted I think it was your daughter, you wanted to have a book for her to read, and that
yep.
has that been something that you just continued, where you just kind of maintain fewer swear words than earlier in your career?
Well, so there are swear words and phrases I won't use anymore. Um, there are words I try to avoid using. Um, but for several books in a row, when Emma was young, I avoided any kind of swear words at all because I wanted her to be able to read these books. Um, as she grew older, I decided it was okay to have some some swear words here and there. And but I still will get emails from or letters from people complaining about the language. And I'm aware of that. I sort of think that you don't want the language to interfere with the pleasure of a book. So you're balancing a couple of things here. On the one hand, as you said, bad guys are often not very cautious about their language, right? And it's our job as a novelist to make the bad guys sound like real bad guys. On the other hand, you don't want people hung up on the language or embarrassed to listen to it in front of their kids when they're driving in a car or something like that. So I basically feel I try, if I can reduce the number of obscenities, I'll do that as
Mhm.
much as possible.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
if
if you want to be a
the books don't
professional writer,
suffer, yeah,
yeah, I mean, if you want to make a career out of writing, it's all about addition. You want to build a readership, and as silly as it might seem, using a few F words here and there, if it keeps people away. A couple of years ago, I had kind of done it wasn't really a project. It was just something I was thinking about at the time. I went through like some recent David Baldacci novels, Lee Child novels, and on Amazon, very makes it you can do like a search for words in the book, and
yeah,
I don't think there were any F words or any, you know what I mean? Like they specifically were going out of their way. Because again, it helps just kind of keep that readership in place. Because I mean, everyone, I'm sure you've gotten some, bad Amazon reviews where it was like, this was a great book if it wasn't for all this swear
yeah.
words.
Yeah, and so why make it difficult to build your readership? You know, if you're obsessed with authenticity, um, you can still create dialogue that sounds authentic without having it sound like David Mamet, you know, which I love. I love David Mamet's plays,
Yeah.
but they don't all people don't always talk like that, and they don't always have to talk like that.
Yeah. You had mentioned Nick Heller. You have done now four Nick Heller novels, is that correct?
Mhm.
When you wrote the first, well, first of all, for people who aren't aware, can you just kind of give a quick overview of Nick Heller as a character?
Yeah, he's a special forces, former special forces operative who whose father was a sort of Wall Street legend in a bad way, sort of a a bad guy. And um, Nick has seen the dark side of Wall Street, and he is hired as a private spy to work for whether it's a politician or a businessman to sort of uh, penetrate organizations, to gather information. So he basically does spy type work. Um, and he's doing it as a private spy as opposed to someone who works for the FBI or the CIA. And he's been a fun character to write. I haven't written I haven't written Nick in several books. Um, right now we are negotiating to sell the TV rights to Nick Keller. And if that ever goes anywhere, I may do some more Nick Kellers.
So when you wrote that first book with Nick Heller, at that point, did you know, I mean, did you have the idea that that was a character that you wanted to explore again? Because, I mean, besides Nick Heller, the rest of them have all been standalones, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I sort of learned that standalones and series characters are very different. And you cannot have a standalone character. I mean, in a standalone novel, the protagonist's life is turned upside down. And you can't have that happen book after book after book. It's just not plausible. A series character is basically an investigator. It's someone who investigates for CIA, for FBI, for as a private eye. Uh, so the cases, the stories that you tell are different from the stories you can tell in a standalone book. So I knew when I came up with Nick Heller that he was a character who um, I could have appear in more than one book. And it's not that I wanted to, uh, I didn't want us to see character growth. I wanted Nick to be the same from book to book to book. But I wanted us to sort of learn more and more about his background. As the more you read, the more you learn what his family life was like growing up, what his family life is like today, um, what his brother is like, all these characters that that are part of the world will come up in a Nick Heller book. And um, I find, I mean, I love writing series characters because by the time you get to the second one or the third one, you know the voice of the book already. You know, you know what the setup of the book is going to be like. There's a lot of it has been figured out for you by yourself with the first book.
Yeah. And the
So,
reader knows the characters. You don't have to spend a lot of time like
uh,
having to introduce the characters again and everything else.
and people do love continuing characters. They love sort of getting to know them, identifying themselves with characters. This is the reason that TV series are so popular is because you have a continuing character that people begin to identify with. So a series character is a very appealing thing in a lot of ways as a writer.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to the new book, which is, of course, The Oligarch's Daughter, which is officially comes out next week. Um, Before that, though, your career, obviously, I mean, you've been writing for a very long time, and you have had a lot of peers who have come and gone. And last year, when I was chatting with Tess Gerritsen, I told her one of the things I really admired about her career is just the longevity of
Yeah.
that career. Because again, some authors, they just eventually fizzle out for whatever reason. They don't get picked up, or they end up going with a much smaller publisher. They're not getting the same reach. Um, I mean, you're going strong. I mean, you've since the Moscow Club. Is there anything that that you'd say that you would contribute to that longevity, or is it just luck, or is there something? I mean, for Tess, it was one of those things that she said that um, she would oftentimes play with different genres. She didn't want to just write the same type of book. She wanted to always kind of do. I mean, and that kind of the same thing too with you. I mean, you had the Moscow Club was your first one, but then for a while, I want to say you were very. It was like corporate thrillers. I think it was kind of like considered, and then you're doing the Nick Heller books, and now obviously the Oligarch's Daughter is very much like a spy type book. I mean, is that kind of the thing? Kind of like they're all thrillers, but they're type. You're playing the different kind of, I guess, I don't want to say genres because again, it's still spy, but I mean, does any of that make sense?
Yeah, no, you've just answered my question for me, which is
Oh,
that,
perfect. All right.
which is that I think in order to have a longevity, in order to keep going, you want to keep refreshing yourself as a writer and you want to remain interesting. You want your books to remain interesting. So I think that I think what I've done is I have written they're all thrillers. They're all within the genre, but it's a big, capacious genre, and there's um, a lot of ways you can go within the thriller genre. Um, and I have written books that I think spark my interest. And I think if they spark my interest, they spark my readers' interest. Um, when I came up with the idea for The Oligarch's Daughter, um, I I hadn't written a Russia book in years. And it seemed to me that with Putin, with what was going on with Russia, and the Ukraine war that this was a good time to write a thriller involving Russia. So I guess the answer in terms of longevity is to keep it as interesting as possible. Um, and as long as I remain interested, the reader remains interested, I think.
Yeah. Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
like to, I don't like to write the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
Some writers do, I
So,
don't.
so speaking of the oligarch's daughter, as I was telling you in the green room, I found it very impressive that your PR team managed to, have this come out around the time that, we now have an American oligarch. Um, because the cover, obviously, you can tell, yes, Russia, but oligarch's daughter now. Well, what can you tell us? What's the like the elevator pitch on this one for people? And I should just say a bunch of great blurbs on the back here. I mean, um, uh, Karen
Um,
Slaughter, a pitch perfect spy novel. Mark Greaney, among his very best. Linwood Barclay says The Firm on steroids, and some guy named Stephen King says this is hands down his best ever. So yeah, I mean a lot of people are very excited about this. So yeah, what can you tell everybody about the oligarch's daughter?
so it is the story of a regular American guy who falls in love with uh, this photographer without knowing that she is the daughter of a Russian oligarch. And by the time he finds that out, he's already too deeply involved with her and she with him. And then the FBI becomes interested in uh, in leaning on him and forcing him to inform on his father-in-law. But his father-in-law, being a Russian oligarch with kind of shady ties to the Kremlin, is not someone you do that to, and is not someone who you're going to be happy with, who's not someone who's going to be happy with being informed on to the FBI. So as soon as his father-in-law finds out, our hero Paul gets in trouble and he's forced to go on the run. When the book opens, we meet him as under a different name, living in a small town in New Hampshire, under an alias. He's a shipbuilder. He's nothing to do with what he used to do, which was a Wall Street guy. Um, so it's basically, I think of it as a chase novel and a love story combined. Now, is that a good elevator pitch? I have no idea, but that's my elevator.
I love chase novels. That's always that's always good. So when you're writing a book, so you mentioned before, I mean, obviously every book is different. And of course there's levels of research that you would have to do. I don't even want to get into that because we don't really have the time. But do you try to write like a certain amount every day? Do you try to do like a chapter, two chapters? I mean, is there when you're really deep into working on at least a first draft, or is it maybe like a kind of like a Nora Roberts vomit draft thing where you just want to get that whole first draft out as soon as possible?
Um, I try to write at least 2,000 words a day uh, when I'm writing. I'm not always writing, but when I'm writing, I like to, 2,000 words a day is a good scene. And then I try to get the first draft down as quickly as I can. It is sort of a vomit draft in that sense. Um, there's a Russian proverb that says the first pancake is always a lump. And, you know, there's something to that where basically it takes a while for you to figure out your voice, for you to figure out how to make the book right, how to make it good. And the first draft doesn't always do it that way. So I try to get the first draft down. And once I have that, I revise several times. And this is what I've learned is the way that works for me. Anyway.
Yeah. So, what has your ratio been so far on your titles versus what the publisher came in and said, no, we're going to call it this?
Um, I would say 100%. Uh,
Nice.
every single one of my titles my publisher has adopted. This book was sold to my new publisher, Harper, as The Oligarch's Daughter, and it just felt right for the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's a great title. Um, The let's see here. In the time we have remaining, because we could go over a lot of other stuff. I mean, we didn't even get into obviously the high crimes and paranoia, which is the whole film stuff that you had going on. Because a lot of writers, I mean, obviously they'll have stuff optioned, but to have something made and have two things made with major stars in it is incredible.
Yeah.
You're one of the founding members of the International Thriller Writers. Um, how did that come about? I mean, how did like the ITW is now is I think really it's become a really great organization, very supportive of writers, some organizations it feels like they're really there just to, take dues from people to just kind of like keep around. Like the ITW really is very supportive, really helping other writers. I mean, how did all that come about?
Yeah, ITW is the kind of organization I wish was around when I was starting out, because I had no idea how to get an agent, how to get a publisher, even how to write a novel. Um, so David Morrell and Gail Lynns were sitting around one day and decided, why is there no organization for thriller writers the way there is for mystery writers, which is a different part of the genre, really. And they they came up with it, and I actually was involved in some of the brainstorming with them. Um, but I had a book to write, so I said, "Excuse me now, while I write my book." Um, so they and we thought of this as a way to bring aspiring writers together with established best-selling writers. For me, this is a way to pay it forward. Sort of, I was helped by a number of writers when I was starting out, by Robert Ludlum, by Ira Levin, a couple other writers. And this was really important to me. It's sort of, these were writers who took seriously what I was doing and wanted to give me advice on how to do it. And I want to do the same thing for younger writers, which is what I do now in ITW.
And they're starting the Biz Fest, is that
Yeah,
correct? Or what can you tell us about that?
yeah, it's called BizFest, and it's just starting now. It's a for someone who's an aspiring writer, or even more importantly, who's sort of mid-list, mid-career. Um, this is a really useful thing to do. I'm going to participate in one of the lessons of BizFest, which is what I wish they had told me when I started out. Um, so it's a very hands-on, practical, useful way of learning the business from people who know the business well.
Can you give us a spoiler alert? What's the main thing you wish you had known
I
30
can't.
years ago?
I'm not going to tell you that.
That's fine.
You're going to have to sign up.
All right, all right. Um, well, Joe, thank you so much for hanging out. We're up to an hour now. Again, I don't want to take much more of your time, but obviously the newest book, The Oligarch's Daughter, officially comes out next week, hardcover everywhere, ebook, audio book, all that good stuff. How much do you like is the next book already, like going through copy edits? I mean, like
No,
do
no,
we know what's going on next?
I'm way behind on this. I've got it figured out. I've done some writing on it. I haven't done enough writing on it. I've got to just sort of, as soon as this book tour is done, I got to sit down and crank it out. My vomit draft.
Do you typically have like how many books do you have just floating around your head right now? Potential books, I guess I should say.
I have probably two or three.
Okay, good.
But once
Good.
I start writing a book, that's all I focus on is that one book.
Yeah.
I can't really do two at once. I've tried that. It doesn't work for me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't know how some writers are able to do that. They just the morning they'll work on one book, and the afternoon they'll work on another book. It's like, what? What are you talking about? So, all right, well then, yeah. So you are going to be on tour. We on to go over all the stops here. People can go to your website or sign up for your newsletter and see all the different places you'll be on tour. This kicks off next week, right? You're going to be talking
Tuesday.
to David Remnick, right?
I'm talking to David Remnick at the 92nd Street Y in New York. And then later that day, I'll be on, no, earlier that day, rather, I'll be on All Things Considered, talking about Oligarch's daughter.
Yeah, this real quick, because this is such a huge thing now. Oligarchs, it's just become very part of just the zeitgeist. Had there always been oligarchs, or at what point did that really become a thing in Russia?
That became a thing when Russia went from being the Soviet Union to being whatever it is now. Um, Russia was trying to privatize, and so they offered shares in these new companies that would be the big industries like the aluminum and the oil and gas industries in Russia. And if you were lucky enough to know Boris Yeltsin, you got an in and you were able to sort of create these corporations. And these people who were cronies of Yeltsin's became rich, became billionaires, and they were so powerful, they got Yeltsin reelected. Um, they chose Putin as his successor. They were really the kingmakers. So they were really oligarchs in the sense of they ruled. No longer the case today. Oligarchs in Russia, Putin called them in shortly after he came to power and told them all, stay in your lane. If you want to keep your fortune, stay out of politics. And ever since then, they have stayed out of politics.
Hmm, interesting. Well, all right. I'm just thinking about how we have our oligarchs here in the United States, and it's different now. But anyway, by the way, Meryl had, I guess, chimed in on the chat. She says hello. Also, she hopes Nick Heller becomes a network TV series. We all do. And then also, yeah. So January 8th, the official launch for this.
28, yep, yep.
Again, next Tuesday is you have the official launch at, you said it was with the David at the, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the
92
location.
Y in New York.
Nice
Yeah.
Strand Y. Okay. Okay. All right. And then again, if everyone wants to stalk you online, well, where's the best place to do that?
josephfinder.com on my website or on Twitter or on Facebook.
All right, perfect. And then obviously also sign up for Joe's newsletter. So you also get updates through there. So again, Joe, thanks so much for hanging out, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. And yeah, see everyone next time. Bye.